You're listening to Wadcast, a podcast from Wadham College, University of Oxford, bringing you interviews, seminars and stories from our community.
This episode of Wadcast offers an inside peek into the intellectual community of Wadham. Visiting fellow Andrea Mulligan gave a short presentation to other Wadham academics across all disciplines. A researcher in medical ethics and law, Andrea's topic was regulating novel parental relationships, surrogacy and the significance of gestation. It's not aimed at specialists, so it's not too technical. Enjoy this recording and window into the life of our senior common room. And if you like what you hear, do consider subscribing.
I'm delighted to be here fostering intellectual exchange. That's exactly what I'll tell them when I get back to Trinity. Genuinely, I'm delighted to talk to you about my research, which I do think is interesting, but I suppose everyone thinks that about their own research. So my field is medical law and ethics, which fundamentally is a subject I love because, most importantly, it engages the most profound elements of human experience. So life, birth, death, all those things. And in addressing those, law has to grapple with very complex matters of philosophy, of science, of medicine. And I suppose what I try to do in my research, I'm a lawyer, so I'm trying to grapple with those sources, but is essentially try and translate those things into legal principles and legal arguments. And that's difficult, and law struggles to do that, but legislators ultimately, judges ultimately are lawyers, they're non-specialists, and ultimately law has to make those judgments despite not being a specialist. And I think that's kind of what's so interesting about medical law and ethics. And fundamentally, law is pragmatic. It has to make a call. It can't wait for the perfect answer. It just has to decide one way or the other. And that's something else, I really like about law as a subject. It is pragmatic, and you have to achieve an answer, even if it's not the perfect one. Within the field, my specialist area is regulating assisted reproduction and new reproductive technologies. So everything from the technologies that are available at the moment, like IVF, egg and sperm donation and surrogacy, but also things that may become available in the not too distant future, like gene editing and human enhancement. And what I'm really fundamentally interested in, I suppose, is how those new technologies affect the parent-child relationship from the perspective of both the parent and the child. And as those technologies develop, law has this crucial role in regulating the technologies, but also in defining the relationships that arise from them, those familial relationships. Because in a very important sense, law actually creates new forms of parenthood. It's the law that changes somebody from a parent to a donor. It's the law that changes somebody from a mother to a surrogate. And the law is what allows society to define those new relationships and divide, say, gestational and genetic parenthood from parental responsibility. So in a very real sense, those new parental forms are creatures of the law. And I suppose what I'm interested in is figuring out how the law should accommodate and define those new parental roles and duties, while trying to protect everyone involved and essentially in some way, preserve the essence of parenthood. So what I'm going to talk about specifically is this project that I've been working on while I've been here at Wadham, which is this question about surrogacy and the significance of gestation. So as you'll probably know, there are two kinds of surrogacy. Surrogacy generally, of course, is an arrangement whereby a woman gestates a child on behalf of someone else on the basis that they will give the child up for the other person to rear, person or people. There are two kinds. There's traditional surrogacy, whereby the woman is related to the child, and there's gestational surrogacy, whereby the woman is not genetically related to the child. Okay? And that's what I'm really interested in, because gestational surrogacy presents this novel form of parenthood, which is biological but not genetic. We have this totally new kind of biological relationship that we've never encountered before, previous to surrogacy. We do, of course, find it in egg donation. So that is an interesting analogy. It's the same kind of relationship, right? But I'm going to focus on surrogacy for the moment. But law and policy really struggle to accommodate this totally novel form of parenthood. The argument that I'm making in this project is that current law and policy fails to accord enough significance to that gestational relationship. To a large extent, surrogacy proceeds on the basis that the only really important relationships are genetic, that a gestational relationship is not very significant, and essentially that the surrogate is little more than a vessel. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. And furthermore, that when you build surrogacy regulation on that faulty premise, you're really bound to failure, because if you look at examples from adoption, from donor conception, attempts to obscure the reality of biological relationships are generally very, very much doomed to failure. So what I'm going to talk about is why gestation is important and why learning from the experiences of those other novel parental forms, you really have to take it a lot more seriously. So I think it's very interesting, if you look at the way we talk about surrogacy, to look at how the gestational role is routinely and casually minimised. So perhaps the best and most common example of this is the prevalence of the language of carrier or carrying. So commonly the surrogate is described as carrying a baby for another woman. Surrogacy contracts, especially in the US, are usually called gestational carrier agreements. The language of carriage, however, appears in the legislation of this country and of many, many other jurisdictions. But on any understanding of gestation, carry is a wildly inappropriate verb. A person who carries an object transports or moves it from one place to another. That is not what gestation is. The woman who gestates a pregnancy grows the embryo from a minute early organism into a baby. To describe her as carrying that from one place to another is frankly preposterous. And of course you might say, well, we use the language of carriage for pregnancy generally. And I think that's equally problematic. You know, it's all about the historic minimisation of pregnancy, and which has translated into the minimisation of the role of the gestational surrogate. You also find the minimisation in the commercial language around surrogacy. And obviously we're dealing with an arena which in many cases across the world, not so much in this country but elsewhere, is very commercially driven. You know, surrogates are routinely told that they're only a vessel carrying someone else's baby. They're encouraged not to bond with that child in any way. And ironically, commercial surrogacy contracts typically contain these really specific clauses about how the surrogate has to behave. So what she has to eat, drink, exercise, everything. Ironically demonstrating both the fact that she is a vessel in a sense, but also the fact that she's really, really important. Otherwise you wouldn't be so interested in controlling what she ate and telling her everything about the way she had to live her life. Turning to kind of current affairs, I think a really interesting example of the invisibility of the surrogate can be found in some of the coverage of the impact of the war on Ukraine on Ukrainian surrogacy. So Ukraine is one of the leading surrogacy jurisdictions. Arguably, Ukraine did set up its surrogacy laws in such a way as to allow and or encourage surrogacy tourism, some people might call it. But inevitably then, the war caused huge disruption to that. So you have these horrible scenarios where surrogate-born babies can't be collected by the commissioning parents. The surrogate mothers are obviously never intended to be left with these children to look after. They're usually trying to flee with their own families, look after their own husbands, their brothers, their sons who are required to stay and fight. So absolutely horrible scenarios. But some of the coverage of that, it was incredible to see how invisible the surrogates were. Some of the coverage was good, but genuinely some of the coverage was incredible. So headlines like, you know, surrogate babies trapped in Ukraine. In Ireland, it was worst of all. There were, you know, headlines saying Irish babies trapped in Ukraine. You know, you would be forgiven for believing that these babies just popped into existence. You know, maybe with an artificial womb, but certainly not that there was any woman involved in gestating them. But I think it really, you know, this kind of crisis scenario really shows the true colours of how some people view surrogacy. So I think my first thing I'm interested in saying is that, you know, we don't take the role of the gestator seriously, and that's kind of true in both practice and in the law around surrogacy. But why is gestation important? I suppose what's really interesting in getting into what gestation is that even though gestation is objectively fascinating, that you have, you know, one person emerging from the body of another person, it's received very little philosophical attention ever. For the main reason, obviously, being that philosophers until quite recently were all men, and they weren't that interested in gestation. You know, so it's very understudied, which is also kind of exciting from the perspective of people who want to look at it now, because you've got this fascinating topic that is essentially a bit of a tabula rasa in terms of figuring out what it is. And there's really, really interesting philosophy work being done on it now, including by a group of people called the Better Understanding the Metaphysics of Pregnancy group, which is BUMP, is the acronym, which I think is amazing. Anyway, so there's wonderful philosophers. I am a mere lawyer, I'm drawing on their work. But looking at some of that philosophy, you find really interesting arguments. A crucial one is the idea of whether the fetus is a part of the pregnant woman or whether she is a container for the fetus. So is it a part of her, like an organ, or like, her kidneys or her hair, or is it a bun in the oven, a yogurt in the fridge, right? And these are the two different models of pregnancy, the two primary competing models. And I think if you look at surrogacy, obviously, I think people have argued, and it's very clear, that it proceeds on a container-based model, right? The idea is that you can hand this embryo to somebody, get them to gestate it, and then take it back out of the fridge at the end. Whereas if you take seriously the parenthood model, for which there's very good arguments, it's a lot more complex, and it's very, very different picture. Which is not to say that surrogacy is necessarily wrong, but it looks a lot more like something like organ donation, or something much more serious than the container model would suggest. The inadequacy of the container model is reinforced if you look at the material constitution of the fetus, for example, and the physiological relationship to the mother. Often we assume that that the material of the fetus is all about the genetic mother, but that's not actually true. The fetus is almost exclusively composed from material that used to be part of the gestating mother, not actually from the embryo that was originally implanted in her. And of course, as we've said, we know that maternal behaviours in pregnancy affect the fetus. We know all about consuming alcohol, tobacco, all of those things. Similarly, evolving research in epigenetics indicates that gestational conditions can affect gene expression. And we also know that cells from the fetus migrate into the mother's body, which is, and the mother becomes a chimera for a period of time, which could be decades long. So we know that pregnancy is physiologically very, very complicated. And that the container model doesn't really stand up to scrutiny from that perspective. Now, obviously, a difficulty is that all the research on that comes from pregnancies that are not surrogate pregnancies. There are women who are genetically related to the fetus too. So you're inevitably limited. It's very difficult to study surrogacy. There's not very many surrogacies. If you are having a surrogacy, you're probably not going to subject yourself to some kind of interesting scientific trial as well. So there is an informational vacuum. But what we do know suggests that gestation is significant. But the final thing I want to say about why gestation is significant is that I think this sort of like maybe the most interesting thing about this project, which sort of occurred to me by accident, which is that, we do talk about gestation, the gestator being important in terms of identity, in the sense of knowing her being important, in the way that we talk about, say, knowing your sperm donor being important. So identity rights in sperm and egg donation are quite well established, certainly in this jurisdiction and in many others. And gradually people are starting to say, well, maybe it's important to know your surrogate as well, right? Because she gave birth to you. But there is definitely a question as to whether or not it is actually an identity affecting change. Would you be a different person if you were gestated by a different person? And that's something that people almost never talk about. I've never heard someone in the surrogacy literature talking about that. But it's very possibly the case. We don't actually know what constitutes human identity. We think DNA is important, but we know that it's not everything. We know identical twins are not the same person. And beyond that, we don't know an awful lot about what actually makes us an individual person. There's at least a reasonable argument. The person by whom you are gestated affects literally who you are. And if that's true, then we absolutely have to take gestation very, very seriously, because it's absolutely not the case that this is just a container who's growing the baby that would be the same person either way. So those are the reasons that I think we need to take gestation seriously. But I want to just very briefly talk about why, given those reasons, it's very important, I think, in building new family forms from a legal perspective, to make sure that we do it the right way. Because you might say, look, surrogacy is going to happen either way. Like, is there any point in agonizing over this? Once it's lawful, it's going to happen. But I think that experience actually demonstrates that there are right ways and wrong ways to approach new family formations. And I think both adoption and donor-assisted reproduction demonstrate that. In both cases, I think it's clear that attempts to conceal the truth of a person's parentage are futile. That anything that tries to obscure biological truth ultimately doesn't work. And that you can do these new family forms, which were radical when they came about. Adoption was a totally radical idea when it was first introduced, and it was, in many countries, very strongly opposed by lots of people. But there are right ways and wrong ways to introduce new kinds of family forms. And if you look at those examples, what's crucial is that you're transparent and that you're open about the way that you do it. in adoption, historically, the approach was to sever the link between the child and the birth family, essentially to delete that family and place the child in a new family. In lots of cases, to never even tell the child they were adopted. In some cases, to produce falsified birth certificates to the point that they literally still, some people don't know that they're adopted. It's now widely agreed that that's a bad idea, that was the wrong way to approach it. But also moving towards open adoption, where you actually maintain some relationship, is also much more commonly seen as a better approach. Similarly, in the donor-assisted reproduction experience, historically, secrecy was thought to be in everyone's best interests. And that approach has been widely discredited. Certainly, as I said, in this jurisdiction, there are some places who don't agree with that, some jurisdictions that don't agree with that, but most people would agree now that the attitude of keeping parentage secret, of it essentially attempting to deny biology, was the wrong approach. And most importantly, I think, in both adoption and donor conception, the changes were driven by the people themselves, by the children of those new family forms. So the activism of adopted people, the activism of donor conceived people who said, look, we feel wronged by your decisions on this and you have to change the policies. That's the key driver of change. So finally, I suppose my thesis is that we have to learn from those experiences and look at surrogacy and make sure that we're not making the same mistake. Now, I think that it is very problematic to proceed on the basis that the gestator is just a vessel, to not take seriously her contribution, and to absolutely not build law and policy in such a way as to recognise and acknowledge that important relationship, and to some extent preserve an understanding of that as the surrogate-born child grows up. So yeah, that is a potted introduction to what I am studying at the moment, and I would love to hear your views on this, because I think the beauty of this area is that everyone has a view on it, and I would love to hear those.
Thank you very much. I think we have some time for questions, so we can start the conversation before dinner.
Go on. That was excellent, thank you. It's a really, really brilliant introduction to everything, and you raised so many issues. So I was just thinking while you were talking about the situation in the UK, which ironically does recognise the importance of gestation in the sense that the gestational mother, and also, as we know, in the European Court of Human Rights as well, the gestational mother is the mother until a parenting order is made. So there's this, I can't remember how, is it 90 days or something that you have? So the gestational mother has 90 days, so you can't make a parenting order, surrogacy order, until this time has elapsed, in order, presumably, to recognise the impact. And so she's absolutely, apparently at this point, when this time ends, she knows that she's in her right mind, I think, after all the hormones or whatever.
I'm sure she's totally fine.
She's totally fine, and she's agreeing to this, so she gets a sort of last chance to change her mind, and it's this sort of time limit. So it's quite interesting that is recognised in the sense, I think, already, isn't it? In that sense, but they're not in others. And I think your analogy of the sperm donor is super interesting as well, because I mean, this is a one-time 10-minute act, and we, all this stuff about donor anonymity is now, it's very much, an issue which is we need to know who our father is, etc., etc. And then similarly, that hasn't happened with a surrogate mother who's 9 months of, as you say, growing another human.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's really
interesting. So this whole point, so I deliberately felt like I wasn't going to get into the sort of pre-birth orders, post-birth orders question. It's really difficult, and it's such a rabbit hole. But so as Shazia is saying, that the situation in the UK is that the birth mother is the default mother, and essentially unless she consents, parenthood can't switch to the commissioning parents. There are other jurisdictions where there are pre-birth orders, and essentially the commissioning parents, be they the genetic parents or not, are the parents at the time the child is born. You see, I don't think the UK really does respect her as the genetic mother, or just they don't respect her role in a deep sense, because she can refuse consent, but once she consents, that's it. It's this like Solomonic approach whereby the law says you must have one mother. And even though you actually don't only have one mother, because you were surrogate born and there are 2 people who were involved in creating you, we have this obsession with saying there's only one mother. And I think actually this one mother fallacy is actually at the centre of what's wrong here, because it causes us to think in these totally binary terms about it. And anyone who sort of suggests that isn't a great idea gets really quite quickly rebuffed, because the sort of general family law model doesn't really accommodate that very well. So there was a surrogacy case in the Irish Supreme Court where one judge dissented and said, I think they're both the mother. Now, he knew he was in the dissent, so he knew he wouldn't have to deal with the practical consequences of that. But I think that it's that yes, on a sort of superficial level, UK law really respects the gestator, but It doesn't on a deep level because she's out of the picture entirely once she signs that form. Then looking at the kind of US model, say Massachusetts and California, whereby you have a pre-birth order, I mean, I think that's abhorrent that a woman who gives birth to a child, that as the child leaves her body, she has no legal rights in relation to the child. And I think it's unbelievable to me that anyone would think that was acceptable.
Well, I should also add that there are moves now to reform it.
I know.
Based on research with surrogate mothers who are saying they would rather have certainty and actually have a kind of, as soon as the child is born, it's gone.
Yeah.
Which I find really odd as well. But I think you're right. I think there's a sort of reification of motherhood going on in family law.
Yeah.
And, in other jurisdictions as well. And I don't know what, there's lots of sort of discussion about why we have that. But then as you say, in reality, when it really matters, it's a bit suspect, isn't it, how we deal with motherhood. But yeah, I mean, what's the...
Yeah, it's really difficult.
Implications are, but I mean, there's also, you could have kind of second legal, the way that we deal with IVF, it's second legal parents, etc. Same-sex relationships, so you can have a second legal mother, but still maintain the category of mother in the same way.
There are some commentators that have said, like, hardcore, you should just have child sharing agreements. So if you're going to do surrogacy, you basically have to have the same kind of like almost custody sharing arrangement you would have in like a post-divorce or something like that. So actually, I think that's quite a good idea, but it's never going to work. Like, it really means the end of surrogacy. If you go that hardcore, no one's going to sign up to it.
But I can also, while you were talking, I can also imagine some Americans saying, well, but we do understand how important gestation is because we've got this compensatory model, which they do.
Yes.
In the UK, you don't, you pay reasonable expenses, which can, as we know, it's about income loss and all that sort of stuff, but it's not the same as quite like sort of very kind of contractual model, which is this compensation, which we recognise what your body's gone through, etc. So we pay you vast sums of money. So what's the problem then? But I think we can easily rebut that with the kind of ethical that you're talking about, really.
Yeah,
anyway, I'm hugging the floors. But
I think that's an interesting point. Like, I think people obsess too much about the commercial nature of surrogacy and don't think enough about other ethical issues in it. To be honest, I think
so
the money is not the biggest deal.
No, it's not. And I also don't think you... I don't know, you don't just kind of So there's also the question of autonomy here, isn't there, as well? There's also another question about, kind of is there a feminist method underpinning what you're talking about in terms of the autonomy of women? Because that's the other argument that you're going to come up against, which is it's your autonomous choice. And there's lots of discussion in feminism which says this is an autonomous choice, particularly Marxist feminism, for example. So, it's your free labour and you're choosing to use it this way, etc., etc. So I just wondered what your view on that was.
Yeah.
About autonomy.
I mean, I think there's a massive tension about autonomy in surrogacy because, like, in surrogacy regulation, everyone broadly agrees that quite paternalistic rules are quite important. So most people would agree that it's important to require a person to have had a child before if they're going to be a surrogate, because pregnancy is seen as a transformative experience. And I know that some feminists really have a problem with that because they say, women have to be trusted to make their own decisions. I have to say, I think there's an element of paternalism that you have to subscribe to do it safely. But I understand that I would be unpopular with feminists for that. Some feminists for that reason.
I don't know anything about this area, and I'm a psychologist, so this is very new.
Well, it's very relevant.
I'm just wondering, are there any jurisdictions where, say, the shared parenthood situation is already happening? Like, can we look at different examples of this?
Yeah.
It's working well.
So not to my knowledge. So there's these. It's what's really interesting is there was like brilliant writing about this quite a long time ago. So like kind of in the 90s, early 2000s, you had people saying child sharing is the answer to this. We've got to bring this in. Basically, that didn't seem to take off anywhere. Like I do think it's the ideal, but I don't see it. I don't think people would sign up to it. So there's nowhere that actually legally imposed that. But that said, like surrogacy in the UK is quite a good model because there's this sort of tradition of openness. So it's not that unusual in the UK because you've domestic altruistic surrogacy. So it would be quite common for people to know their surrogate, to have a relationship with their surrogate, to be growing up knowing their surrogate. That's quite common here. And like that's really, really positive. So I think in a way it's about sort of like taking actually the kind of organically developing good aspects of UK surrogacy. And the question is then, what kind of legal measure do you put in place to give that real substance? And I have to say that's where this project gets really difficult because what do you say? Like, as I said, if you go too hardcore and impose like a full-on child sharing model, I think you just won't have anyone doing surrogacy or you will have everyone going abroad. And like this is the huge underlying problem. With all of these technologies, they're almost impossible to regulate because if people, the drive to have a child is so profound that if people want to do it, they really will they will go abroad to circumvent the law. And like, you know, you're not going to put the child into care and put their parents into prison, right? So everybody struggles with what do you do with the people who have ignored the law anyway. So there's always this kind of pragmatic balance with saying, here's what we think is ideal, here's the kind of, you know, pragmatic incentives we're going to put in place. And like, it becomes very, very difficult. Yeah, but everyone struggles with it.
And there are lots of countries that are closing it down, aren't they now?
Yeah, well, a lot of countries are closing down international surrogacy completely. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is the other feminist point about which women are doing this.
Well, yeah. Yeah, it's not rich women.
Because you just touched on it, on the relationship between the surrogate child and the gestational mother. Yes, has any research been done on that relationship and what it's like?
Very little. So this is very understudied. There's like the best surrogacy research is in the centre, what's it called, the Centre for like Family, the guys in Cambridge that do like really good longitudinal studies of surrogacy. So they have very good data on like, you know, so on sort of when you tell the child and how you tell the child and transparency and all that kind of thing. And like it sort of supports all the intuitions you would have from donor-assisted reproduction, which is like tell the child early, you know, all that kind of thing. And interestingly, a lot of the experiences of surrogate-born children quite closely mirror the children of international adoption, that they have a kind of identity wobble at about like, I think it's like 11-ish. Like there's ages where they're like, they start to really understand it and they ask a lot of questions. But we just don't know an awful lot about that relationship between, so either the kind of like the social relationship between gestational surrogates and the children, or the physiological side is virtually completely unknown because we just don't have any research on that. So it is a question of like you have to make policy to some extent in the dark, you know, because you're not going to have like scientific evidence that's really going to inform it, you know. And there's also like a lack of, I suppose, appetite for researching it to some extent as well. Like it's a very small cohort of people, but you know, I'd like someone to research it. Someone should give someone a lot of money to do an expensive study.
Yeah, the physiological side and the epigenetics work that you mentioned is really interesting because that has such profound implications.
Absolutely.
We just don't know the answer. So
Yeah, I
suppose short of someone running that research experiment, how would you even...
Because even epigenetics is not very, like the research base for it is not very well established, you know, in the context of ordinary pregnancy. I met a geneticist at Trinity to talk about it once and he was just like, no way. It was just like, oh, I'm not interested. You know, I guess because he's a pure DNA guy. He was like, not that interested in epigenetics. But I mean, you know, fundamentally, I think DNA is not everything. I think humans have this desire to identify like what is the essence of humanity and say, okay, we found it. You know, and there are really interesting historic examples of that, like before anyone knew anything about DNA. But now there is a real genetic essentialism at the moment. And some of that I think comes from this assumption, as I said, that like motherhood and fatherhood have to be the same, you know. But they don't necessarily. Gestation might mean something even though men can't do it. Shock. But none of this is to say that I don't think genetics are important. I think genetics are really important. So I spent most of my time thinking about the importance of like knowing your sperm donor and all this. And I do think that's really important. But the idea that it would be important to know your sperm donor but not know the person who gestated you is just like
it is
bananas.
Knowledge is quite interesting, given how different they actually are.
Yeah.
And it comes from the child's rights perspective as well, doesn't it? A lot of that as well.
Yeah.
So, and that's been quite interesting because what's driven it has been the child's rights movement rather than...
Very much so, but then they do tend to not pay enough attention to the woman, I think.
Exactly, but that's why the feminist stuff is really important.
Really important. But then you have a lot of the children's rights people are often quite in favour, for example, of pre-birth orders, and they love certainty and everything, but I don't know, short-term certainty doesn't necessarily...
No, exactly.
You know?
It's not today long-term. Well, it's a shame. But I think it's a shame that the reform in the UK is going towards the opposite direction.
Yeah, like it's very likely that the UK will switch to a pre-birth model. I just think this is the difficulty. If you have like all the surrogates saying, "Oh, well, I'd prefer certainty," that's not decisive. You don't just ask them, and like that is a whole problem with lawmaking. Like, do you just ask the people whom the law is most centrally going to affect, or do you look at a much broader analysis?
So the interesting research would be with the children of surrogates, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
To add in that perspective. I don't know if anyone's doing that.
I think guys in Cambridge are probably doing some of that, but like you have huge selection bias problems as well, right? Because if you're part of a failed surrogacy arrangement, you're not going to join a longitudinal survey about surrogacy. You know, like, so obviously the people who are involved are all like, yeah, it was great. Talk to you again in 7 years. You know, like there's huge selection bias problems with it.
So Andrea, what happens in the post-surrogacy agreement if the gestation mother decides to keep the child? Then
so this, I think this is a problem as well. Actually, that I think Shazia knows more about the UK law than I do, but I understand it in the UK you can only have a parental order if the mother consents, and if she doesn't, you have to go via adoption. Isn't that right?
Yeah, you have to make an application.
Yeah, you have to make an adoption app. So and I think usually, I don't know, is there a general rule as to what the courts would do in that situation?
I've got this in my area, but there's the really famous case where it was an issue. I think she did retain residence of the child, but they had quite significant contact with father and the family.
Yeah.
Because it was preserved, this idea that she is the mother until the parental order is made.
But like,
it was only if she would be suitable in some way that you'd be able to shift the burden to an adoption.
Yeah.
She wasn't in that case.
But just 2 points about that as well. I think that like if a surrogacy arrangement breaks down, there is no good answer to it. It's always going to be messy, and a court, in my view, a court always has to have discretion. You're always going to end up in front of a judge. You're always going to end up doing a best interest analysis, right? So it's not, you should never be saying, okay, well, if it breaks down, who gets to keep the child? You can't have a general rule for that. So I think that's really problematic. So you shouldn't, and then secondly, you shouldn't just be thinking about the arrangements that break down. You know, the vast majority of surrogacy arrangements don't break down, they work. You have to say, well, when they work and when everyone does agree, how do you still protect the rights and interests of everyone involved? You know, and I think it's those arrangements that I have a particular problem with, which is, you know, they go as planned, but the surrogate's then invisible. You know, she is deleted. There's a new birth cert. You know, and I think that's not a good enough way to approach it either. You know, and we obsess so much in surrogacy discussions about the ones that break down, and actually we don't think enough about the ones that don't. You know, the vast majority.
Yeah, and if I tell you a story about a real story, that someone came to me for advice, and it was somebody who was a surrogate, who stayed in touch with the family, and in fact they were kind of friends, had twins for the surrogate. She was the surrogate for the mother, and they kept in touch. And then the new mother under the parent, so parental order was made, so she was no longer the mother, as it were. And the mother was then had cancer, terminal cancer, and died.
Oh my God!
Yeah, it's a really sad story. And then because they were, for whatever reason, the surrogate mother then married the father.
What?
Because they were all really good friends, and it was obviously developed into a relationship. And then she became the actual...
Did she have to adopt the child then?
Exactly. So,
yeah.
So the dilemma for her was, you know, came to me for advice, which is, you know, I wasn't a practicing lawyer then, but it was, you know, I want to be recognised as the legal mother, and I'm not.
Yeah.
And I want the birth certificate to be altered. So the advice is, well, you can't. I mean, you have to apply for adoption. That's the only way you're going to do it. Or she had parental responsibility. But the real kind of need for this woman to be recognised, but, you know, I gave birth to them.
That's amazing.
So it was a really unusual case, and there was no provision in the law for this type of situation.
But isn't that incredible?
Yeah.
But it also really demonstrates my original point, which is that like these relationships are all creatures of law, right? The law weighs in and defines all these relationships, and then ends up in situations like that, where this woman is like, I gave birth to this child, and then the law is like, well, sorry, I don't care. You're gonna have to adopt it.
Yes. So yeah, and then she didn't want to put the kids through the trauma of adoption proceedings, and just, you know, decided to just deal with the fact that on the birth certificate she wasn't the mother.
That's an amazing story.
It's an amazing story, isn't it?
Yeah.
She sought all this legal advice, and all these barristers said to her, well, there's nothing you can do. And I was like, I'm afraid, there's nothing you can do. So, yeah, bit of a difficult one. But, yeah.
In that case, did the child know everything?
The children did know. So it was a kind of open surrogacy arrangement, which is that they, you know, she started off not knowing that, but then they decided to have an open surrogacy arrangement, and then they all became friends. And then, unfortunately, the mother then died, and then it developed into a relationship with the father.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it is a really interesting story. Yeah. But, you know, I guess my advice to her was, well, you know, you have a loving, you know, they reckon, so the social motherhood was hers.
Yeah.
And she could adopt them or whatever, but, you know, you could see why she wanted to be recognised legally, you know, given everything she'd done.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was just an unfortunate series of events which led to...
Yeah. And people really care deeply about legal status. You know, like, legal status really matters to people. Like, in Ireland, we have an awful lot of adoption cases that only go through, like, on, you know, the eve of the child's 18th birthday. You might say, well, why do you care? What does it matter? people really want that status. Now, occasionally you get very rich families that are trying to avoid inheritance tax. Occasionally. But mostly it's people who are not rich and just want to be recognised legally as members of a family. No?
And I think the question of certainty is really important, because it's certainty for who? It's not for the child, is it? It's certainty for the adults.
No.
So I think a child's right perspective would be really interesting as well.
Yeah. And I think the certainty obsession is kind of like, it is trying to find certainty in a situation that is inherently uncertain, because it's wildly complicated. So you can't just say, right, let's all just make rules for this, because, you know.
There'll be all sorts of arguments about how you under child welfare, about how you could destabilise the family if you had an open surrogacy arrangement. You know, because you're having this, you know, those are the kind of arguments.
Absolutely,
Same-sex relationships, weren't there? That, you know, if you let the donor,
totally,
you're going to destabilise the relationship of the parents, you know, and their relationship with the children. So it's difficult, isn't it? Because it's very hard area.
Yeah, that's what's fun about it. It's mainly question generating rather than answer generating.